Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We are learning Mishna Pesachim, Parakeh, chapter 5, Mishna Daled, Mishna 4. Okay. The first thing that we have to know is that the Torah has a law, a prohibition, about shechting the carbon Pesach while you possess chametz. By the time you're shechting your carbon Pesach, you're not allowed to possess chametz. That's a separate prohibition on its own. But besides, if you possess chametz while you shech the carbon Pesach, that is its own law, its own prohibition. Now, it's this prohibition that this Mishnah is going to come to discuss. So Mishna Daled reads, "Hashoichet es haPesach al hachametz." If someone shechts the carbon Pesach with over chametz, meaning the person who shechts it has chametz in his possession, or if anyone in the chabura, if anyone in the group, right, we say that a Pesach is eaten by a group of people. If anybody in that group possesses chametz at the time, then there will be a prohibition for the person who shechts the carbon Pesach, because either he or one of the members of the group has chametz in his possession. Now, according to this is a very plain statement, right? It just seems to say a very simple statement. But as we move on and we see the other opinions, we'll see what the statement implies. And that is Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Av hatamid. Rabbi Yehuda says, and this is all based on the question of how we learned, how we derive from the psukim in the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda says that not only on Erev Pesach, if you shech the carbon Pesach with chametz in your possession, do you transgress a prohibition? The same thing happens if you on Erev Pesach when the carbon tamid is slaughtered, right? Whoever slaughters the carbon tamid, after the daily sacrifice, assuming he's referring here to the afternoon sacrifice, and that is that if the person who is shechting the carbon tamid of the afternoon, or the person who is offering it, sprinkling the blood, if they possess chametz, they have their own prohibition of the fact that they shechted the carbon tamid on Erev Pesach with chametz in their possession. When I have chametz the rest of the year possession, when you shech the carbon tamid, no problem. But Erev Pesach, where there's a prohibition to own chametz, now you go ahead and shech the carbon tamid with chametz in your possession, or you offer the carbon tamid with chametz in your possession, you now have transgressed a extra prohibition. Besides for the fact that you're owning chametz you're not supposed to, you've now done another prohibition. Now, the fact that the Tanakama only mentions somebody shechting the carbon Pesach transgresses a prohibition means that he argues on this. Rabbi Yehuda, as on the Tanakama says you shech the carbon Pesach Erev Pesach with chametz in possession, you transgress the prohibition. The carbon tamid with chametz in possession, there's no prohibition about that. Rabbi Yehuda adds there's a prohibition even for shechting the carbon tamid with chametz in your possession. Next, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, now Rabbi Shimon's opinion gets a little bit intricate. He says like this: as we have learned until now, we learned previously, if you're shechting, if you designate an animal for the carbon Pesach, and as you shecht it, you had in mind that it should be for a carbon shlabim. What happens to the animal? What happens to the sacrifice? What happens to the animal? Puzzle, right? It doesn't. You can't even offer it. It's not like you could offer it and not be yotzi, like we find in other places, in other situations. You had a carbon shlamim, and you shechted it as an oila. So the carbon is good. You can continue with the service of the carbon. Just so you got to bring another carbon because you don't fulfill your obligation with that. In the case of a carbon Pesach, on Erev Pesach, and you shecht it shaloi l'shma, you shecht it not for its designated purpose, becomes invalid. Okay, so Shimon says like this: Ha Pesach bar ba'asar. If we're talking about the carbon Pesach on Erev Pesach, lishma chayev. If you shecht the carbon Pesach for its own sake, meaning it was a carbon Pesach and you shechted it as a carbon Pesach, you will then be liable for the prohibition of shechting the carbon Pesach with chametz in your possession. The shaloi lishma. But if you shechted it not for its designated purpose, you shechted the carbon Pesach and you had in mind it's going to be that it should be for a shlamim, and now that animal, that whole carbon now is invalidated, putter, then you're exempt for this prohibition. According to Rabbi Shimon, if it comes out that this carbon, you shechted this carbon and it got messed up because of the fact that you had validated the carbon as you with the wrong thought, then it comes out that your shechita wasn't a shechita. And therefore, the fact that you're not going to be transgressing the prohibition of shechting the carbon pesach with chametz in your possession. Reb Shimon holds the following principle. And the principle goes shchita she'ena re'uya lo yishma shchita. A shchita that's not fit, meaning a shchita that doesn't bring to eating because something invalidated it, not considered a shchita, doesn't have the status, doesn't have the halachic status, halachic recognition as a shchita, as a slaughter. So it's like you shot in the head. If you shoot in the head, owning chametz doesn't make a difference. So too, even though you shechted it, you didn't act for shchita. And it was an act for shchita on what was supposed to be the carbon pesach. But it comes out now that it was invalidated because you had intention for a different carbon. So now the shchita was not a good shchita. It wasn't a shchita that brought to eating. It's not considered a shchita. It's not considered an act of slaughtering. If it's not considered an act of slaughtering, you don't transgress the prohibition of slaughtering the carbon pesach over a carbon with chametz in your possession. Again, according to the Tanna Kama Rebbe Yehuda, the first two opinions, they don't make this distinction. It means according to them, the mere fact that you shechted the animal that was supposed to be a carbon pesach with chametz in your possession, you transgress the prohibition. But Reb Shimon says no. It's only going to work if it comes out. We're only going to buy a carbon pesach. It'll only be this way if you shecht it on erev pesach and it was a good and you shechted it properly, and you shechted it in a way that now it will be the carbon pesach you'll eat from. And now Reb Shimon continues. Usha'ar kalazvachim. Now, what about it's erev pesach and we have and we're talking about other karbanos. Other karbanos. There is time erev pesach to bring other karbanos. There is time. Before the Tabet Shal Ben Rabbayim is brought, there'll be time to bring other karbanos, erev pesach, after the point of time you're not supposed to possess chametz. So when it comes to all other karbanos, bein lishman, bein shalei lishman pater, whether you shechted them for their own sake or not, they're going to be pater. That means even if, whatever it may be, right, even though we say by other karbanos, we say that if, let's say, I designated an animal for a shlomim, and I sacrificed, and I decided in my mind, I said I'm shechting it to be an oila. So the halacha is the carbon is kosher, meaning the carbon is unvalidated. You can continue the rest of the service of the carbon. You're going to have to bring another carbon for your own obligation, but this is a kosher carbon. So it comes out here that it's erev pesach, and I shechted another carbon. I shechted a shlomim, let's say. I shechted an oila, right? Whether I did it for its own sake or I didn't do it for its own sake, meaning even though in both these examples it's a kosher carbon, pater, you are exempt even if you own chametz in your possession. And that may not sound so novel, but as we move on, you'll see what's special about what he's saying. So again, other karbanos on erev pesach, if you shech them and you shechted them properly, and you own chametz and you have chametz in your possession at the time, exempt. You have not transgressed that prohibition. By the way, anytime we say that you do transgress this prohibition of shechting a carbon with chametz in your possession, the chametz not with you in your pocket in the Beis Hamikdash. That's not what it means. It means it's in your house. You're shechting about the Beis Hamikdash. The chametz is not by you in the Beis Hamikdash. It's in your house. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, you transgress the prohibition. Now, Reb Shimon continues. Uva moyed. Now, what about on the rest of Yontif? The rest of Pesach? You're not allowed to own Pesach. Not allowed to chametz for the whole Pesach. So says Reb Shimon during the rest of Pesach, and we're talking about you shechted and we're talking about now you shechted the carbon Pesach. Now, why are you shechting a carbon Pesach after the first night of Pesach? You're not supposed to be, but that's what you did. Meaning you had an animal that was supposed to be your carbon Pesach, and for some reason it did not get shechted as a carbon Pesach. Wasn't shechted as a carbon Pesach. And now you went ahead and it's Chalamoid, and you shechted it as a carbon Pesach. That's what you did. Yeah. That's what you did. So the halacha is pater. You know why? You're exempt. Because an animal that was supposed to be a carbon Pesach, that you went ahead and you shechted it on Pesach for a carbon Pesach, but it's not on the first night anymore, becomes invalidated. Okay, let me agree. He has not transgressed. Okay. One second, let me just clarify this. Anytime you take this animal that was supposed to be a carbon Pesach and you shecht it as a carbon Pesach, not on the first night, it's invalid. That's the din. It's invalid. Okay? So if it's invalid, according to Rabbi Shimon, what do we have here? A shchita she'ena ruya. We have a shchita that doesn't bring to eating. That's not a good shchita. And therefore, if it's not a good shchita, the fact that I owned chametz at the time doesn't make a difference, at least from that part of the prohibition. The fact you're owning chametz, you're transgressing, that in itself. But the fact that you shechted a carbon Pesach with chametz in your possession doesn't make a difference. Shaloi lishmoi chayev. Now, let's say this animal that was supposed to be a carbon Pesach, and you didn't shecht it for a carbon Pesach, but you know what you shechted it for? A shlabim. Or an oila. Shechted it for something else. Then it's still a kosher carbon. It's a kosher carbon. The animal is supposed to be a carbon Pesach that you didn't shecht it on the first night. And now it's after the first night. And now you shecht it for a different carbon, not for a carbon Pesach, for a different carbon. The halacha is that the automatic status of that animal now is that it's a shlamim. That's how you treat it. But it's a kosher carbon. If it's a kosher carbon, so it's a shchita ruya, it's a good shchita. And therefore, if you own chametz then, if you're owning chametz when you shecht that animal is supposed to be a carbon Pesach, not as a carbon Pesach, so now it's a good carbon, you transgress the prohibition. The point here is, according to Reb Shimon is telling us something very interesting. Reb Shimon is telling us that there is a prohibition of shechting a carbon Pesach, an Erev Pesach, with chametz in your possession, and there's a prohibition of shechting other sacrifices over the rest of Pesach with chametz in your possession. It's just that on Erev Pesach, the only time shechting a carbon with chametz in your possession is going to be a prohibition into itself, is when it's the carbon Pesach. Because in Erev Pesach, that prohibition only applies to the carbon Pesach. But after the first night of Pesach, when again there continues a prohibition to own chametz, now we say that okay, so now that it's after Pesach, what happens now with the animal supposed to be the carbon Pesach? So we say like this: if you basically treat it like any other carbon, because you shechted it as a different carbon, and it's a kosher carbon, you're going to be liable. You're going to be liable for this prohibition of shechting a carbon with chametz in your possession on Pesach. Usha'ar kalazvachim, when it comes to other sacrifices, not a carbon Pesach, other sacrifices. Bein lishman, bein shalei lishman, whether you did it for their own sake or not. And again, it's a kosher carbon, it's still a kosher carbon, it's still a good carbon. Chayev, you're liable. If it's not Erev Pesach anymore, any carbon that was shechted and it's a kosher carbon, could be used as a carbon, and it's not Erev Pesach, it's after Pesach, then you'll be liable for shechting your carbon on Pesach with chametz in your possession. The exception being if it was a sin offering, a carbon chatas. Because if you shecht a carbon chatas not for its own sake, it's invalidated. A shlamim shaloi lishma, not for its own sake, is still kosher. Okay. An oilet not for its own sake is still kosher. A carbon pesach and a carbon chatas that are shechted not for their own sake, they're shechted for a different carbon in mind, is invalidated. It's not good. If it's not good, says Reb Shimon, it's a shchita she'ena ruya. It's not a shchita that brought to eating, and therefore it doesn't have the status of a shchita. So Reb Shimon, so I'm going to read to you the summary here on the bottom. I'll kind of put it all together. In summary, the Tana Kama maintains that the prohibition of slaughtering an offering while in possession of chametz applies only to the Pesach offering. That's the first opinion. That's the only one it applies to, and on Erev Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda maintains that it applies both to the Pesach and to the afternoon Tamid offering of Erev Pesach. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon makes 3 points. A person is liable for transgressing this prohibition only if the offering he slaughtered is valid. That's number one. Number two, the prohibition applies to all offerings during Pesach. Again, all valid offerings. And C, however, on Erev Pesach, it applies only to the Pesach offering. And it was done in a valid way. That's Rav Shimon's opinion. That is a 3-way argument that we have here in the Mishnah. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. So